Episode 6 of Space Prison by Tom Godwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Space Prison, Episode 6, Part 2. It was early morning as Bill Humboldt sat by the fire in his cave and studied the map Craig had made of the plateau's mountain. Craig had left the mountain nameless, and he dipped his pen in ink to write Craig Mountains. "Bill," Delmont Anders entered very quietly, what he had to tell already evident on his face. "He died last night, Bill." It was something he had been expecting to come at any time, but the lack of surprise did not diminish the sense of loss. Lake had been the last of the old ones, the last of those who had worked and fought and shortened the years of their lives that the young ones might have a chance to live. Now he was gone. Now a brief era was ended, a valiant, bloody chapter written and finished. And he was the new leader, who would decree how the next chapter would be written, only 4 years older than the boy who was looking at him with an unconscious appeal for reassurance on his face. "You'd better tell Jim," he said. "Then, a little later, I want to talk to everyone about the things we'll start doing as soon as spring comes." "You mean the hunting?" Delmont asked. "No, more than just the hunting." He sat for a while after Delmont left, looking back down the years that had preceded that day, back to that first morning on Ragnarok. He had set a goal for himself that morning when he left his toy bear in the dust behind him and walked beside Julia into the new and perilous way of life. He had promised himself that some day he would watch the Gurns die and beg for mercy as they died, and he would give them the same mercy they had given his mother. As he grew older, he realized that his hatred alone was a futile thing. There would have to be a way of leaving Ragnarok, and there would have to be weapons with which to fight the Gurns. These would be things impossible and beyond his reach, unless he had the help of all the others in united, coordinated effort. To make certain of that united effort, he would have to be their leader. So, for 11 years he had studied and trained, until there was no one who could use a bow or spear quite as well as he could. No one who could travel as far in a day, or spot a unicorn ambush as quickly. And there was no one, with the exception of George Ord, who had studied as many textbooks as he had. He had reached his first goal. He was leader. For all of them, there existed the second goal, the hope of someday leaving Ragnarok and taking Athena from the Gurns. For many of them, perhaps, it was only wishful dreaming, but for him it was the prime driving force of his life. There was so much for them to do, and their lives were so short in which to do it. For so long as he was leader, they would not waste a day in idle wishing. When the others were gathered to hear what he had to say, he spoke to them. "We're going to continue where the old ones had to leave off. We're better adapted than they were, and we're going to find metals to make a ship if there are any to be found. Somewhere on Ragnarok, on the northwest side of a range similar to the Craig Mountains on the plateau, is a deep valley that the Dunbar expedition called the Chasm. They didn't investigate it closely, since their instruments showed no metals there, but they saw strata in one place that was red, an iron discoloration. Maybe we can find a vein there that was too small for them to have paid any attention to. So we'll go over the Craigs as soon as the snow melts from them." "That will be in early summer," George Ord said, his black eyes thoughtful. "Whoever goes will have to time their return for either just before the prowlers and unicorns come back from the north, or wait until they've all migrated down off the plateau." It was something Humboldt had been thinking about and wishing they could remedy. Men could elude unicorn attacks wherever there were trees large enough to offer safety, and even prowler attacks could be warded off wherever there were trees for refuge. spears holding back the prowlers who would climb the trees while arrows picked off the ones on the ground. But there were no trees on the plateau, and to be caught by a band of prowlers or unicorns, there was certain death for any small party of 2 or 3. For that reason, no small parties had ever gone up on the plateau except when the unicorns and prowlers were gone, or nearly so. It was an inconvenience, and it would continue for as long as their weapons were the slow-to-reload bows. "You're supposed to be our combination inventor-craftsman," he said to George. "No one else can compare with you in that respect. Besides, you're not exactly enthusiastic about such hard work as mountain climbing. So from now on, you'll do the kind of work you're best suited for. Your first job is to make us a better bow. Make it a crossbow, with a sliding action to draw and cock the string, and with a magazine of arrows mounted on top of it." George studied the idea thoughtfully. "The general principle is simple," he said. "I'll see what I can do." "How many of us will go over the Craig Mountains, Bill?" Dan Barber asked. "You and I," Humboldt answered. "A 3-man party under Bob Craig will go into the Western Hills, and another party under Johnny Stevens will go into the Eastern Hills." He looked toward the adjoining cave where the guns had been stored for so long, coated with unicorn tallow to protect them from rust. "We could make gunpowder if we could find a deposit of saltpeter. We already know where there's a little sulfur. The guns would have to be converted to flintlocks, though, since we don't have what we need for cartridge priming material. Worse, we'd have to use ceramic bullets. They would be inefficient, too light, and destructive to the bores. But we would need powder for mining if we ever found any iron. And if we can't have metal bullets to shoot the gurns, we can have bombs to blast them with." "Suppose," Johnny Stevens said, "that we never do find the metals to make a ship. How will we ever leave Ragnarok if that happens?" "There's another way, a possible way, of leaving here without a ship of our own. If there are no metals, we'll have to try it." "Why wait?" Bob Craig demanded. "Why not try it now?" "Because the odds would be about 10,000 to 1 in favor of the Gurns. But we'll try it if everything else fails." George made, altered, and rejected 4 different types of crossbows before he perfected a reloading bow that met his critical approval. He brought it to where Humboldt stood outside the caves early one spring day when the grass was sending up the first green shoots on the southern hillsides and the long winter was finally dying. "Here it is," he said, handing Humboldt the bow. "Try it." He took it, noting the fine balance of it. Projecting down from the center of the bow, at right angles to it, was a stock shaped to fit the grip of the left hand. Under the crossbar was a sliding stock for the right hand, shaped like the butt of a pistol and fitted with a trigger. Mounted slightly above and to one side of the crossbar was a magazine containing 10 short arrows. The pistol grip was in position near the forestock. He pulled it back the length of the crossbar, and it brought the string with it, stretching it taut. There was a click as the trigger mechanism locked the bowstring in place, and at the same time a concealed spring arrangement shoved an arrow into place against the string. He took quick aim at a distant tree and pressed the trigger. There was a twang as the arrow was ejected. He jerked the sliding pistol grip forward and back to reload, pressing the trigger an instant later. Another arrow went its way. By the time he had fired the 10th arrow in the magazine, he was shooting at the rate of 1 arrow per second. On the trunk of the distant tree, like a bristle of stiff whiskers, the 10 arrows were driven deep into the wood in an area no larger than the chest of a prowler or a head of a unicorn. "This is better than I hoped for," he said to George. "1 man with one of these could equal 6 men with ordinary bows." "I'm going to add another feature," George said. "Bundles of arrows, 10 to the bundle in special holders to carry in the quivers. To reload the magazine, you just slap down a new bundle of arrows, in no more time than it would take to put one arrow in an ordinary bow. I figured that with practice, a man should be able to get off 40 arrows in not much more than 20 seconds. George took the bow and went back in the cave to add his new feature. Humboldt stared after him, thinking, if he can make something like that out of wood and unicorn gut, what would he be able to give us if he could have metal? Perhaps George would never have the opportunity to show what he could do with metal, but Humboldt already felt sure that George's genius would, if it ever became necessary, make possible the alternate plan for leaving Ragnarok. The weeks dragged into months, and at last enough snow was gone from the Craigs that Humboldt and Dan Barber could start. They met no opposition. The prowlers had long since disappeared into the north, and the unicorns were very scarce. They had no occasion to test the effectiveness of the new automatic crossbows in combat, a lack of opportunity that irked Barber. "Any other time, if we had ordinary bows," he complained, "the unicorns would be popping up to charge us from all directions." "Don't fret," Humboldt consoled him. "This fall, when we come back, they will be." They reached the mountain and stopped near its foot where a creek came down, its water high and muddy with melting snows. There they hunted until they had obtained all the meat they could carry. They would see no more game when they went up the mountain's canyons. A poisonous weed replaced most of the grass in all the canyons, and the animals of Ragnarok had learned long before to shun the mountain. They found the canyon that Craig and his men had tried to explore and started up it. It was there that Craig had discovered the quartz and mica, and so far as he had been able to tell, the head of that canyon would be the lowest of all the passes over the mountain. The canyon went up the mountain diagonally so that the climb was not steep, although it was constant. They began to see mica and quartz crystals in the creek bed, and at noon on the second day they passed the last stunted tree. Nothing grew higher than that point but the thorny poison weeds, and they were scarce. The air was noticeably thinner there, and their burdens heavier. A short distance beyond they came to a small rock monument, Craig's Turnback Point. The next day they found the quartz crystals in place. A mile farther was the vein the mica had come from. Of the other minerals Craig had hoped to find, however, there were only traces. The fourth day was an eternity of struggling up the now steeper canyon under loads that seemed to weigh hundreds of pounds, forcing their protesting legs to carry them 50 steps at a time, at the end of which they would stop to rest while their lungs labored to suck in the thin air in quick, panting breaths. It would have been much easier to have gone around the mountain, but the chasm was supposed to be like a huge cavity scooped out of the plateau beyond the mountain, rimmed with sheer cliffs a mile high. Only on the side next to the mountain was there a slope leading down into it. They stopped for the night where the creek ended in a small spring. There the snow still clung to the canyon's walls, and there the canyon curved, offering them the promise of the summit just around the bend, as it had been doing all day. The sun was hot and bright the next morning as they made their slow way on again. The canyon straightened, the steep walls of it flattening out to make a pair of ragged shoulders with a saddle between them. They climbed to the summit of the saddle, and there, suddenly before them, was the other side of the world, and the chasm. Far below them was a plateau, stretching endlessly like the one they had left behind them. But the chasm dominated all else. It was a gigantic, sheer-walled valley, 100 miles long by 40 miles wide, sunk deep in the plateau with the tops of its mile-high walls level with the floor of the plateau. The mountain under them dropped swiftly away, sloping down and down to the level of the plateau, and then on, down and down again, to the bottom of the chasm, that was so deep its floor was half hidden by the morning shadows. "My God," Barber said. "It must be over 3 miles under us to the bottom, on the vertical. 10 miles of 33% grade. If we go down, we'll never get out again." "You can turn back here if you want to," Humboldt said. "Turn back?" Barber's red whiskers seemed to bristle. "Who in the hell said anything about turning back?" "Nobody," Humboldt said, smiling a little at Barber's quick flash of anger. He studied the chasm, wishing that they could have some way of cutting the quartz crystals and making binoculars. It was a long way to look with the naked eye. Here and there, the chasm thrust out arms into the plateau. All the arms were short, however, and even at their heads the cliffs were vertical. The morning shadows prevented a clear view of much of the chasm, and he could see no sign of the red-stained strata that they were searching for. In the southwest corner of the chasm, far away and almost imperceptible, he saw a faint cloud rising up from the chasm's floor. It was impossible to tell what it was, and it faded away as he watched. Barber saw it too, and said, "It looked like smoke. Do you suppose there could be people, or some kind of intelligent things, living down there?" "It might have been the vapor from hot springs, condensed by the cool morning air," he said. "Whatever it was, we'll look into it when we get there." The climb down the steep slope into the chasm was swifter than that up the canyon, but no more pleasant. Carrying a heavy pack down such a grade exerted a torturous strain upon the backs of the legs. The heat increased steadily as they descended. They reached the floor of the valley the next day, and the noonday heat was so great that Humboldt wondered if they might not have trapped themselves into what the summer would soon transform into a monstrous oven where no life at all could exist. There could never be any choice, of course. The mountains were passable only when the weather was hot. The floor of the valley was silt, sand, and gravel. They would find nothing there. They set out on a circuit of the chasm's walls, following along close to the base. In many places, the mile-high walls were without a single ledge to break their vertical faces. When they came to the first such place, they saw that the ground near the base was riddled with queer little pits, like tiny craters of the moon. As they looked, there was a crack like a cannon shot, and the ground beside them erupted into an explosion of sand and gravel. When the dust had cleared away, there was a new crater where none had been before. Humboldt wiped the blood from his face where a flying fragment had cut it and said, "The heat of the sun loosens rocks up on the rim. When one falls a mile in 1.5 gravity, it's traveling like a meteor." They went on, through the danger zone. As with the peril of the chasm's heat, there was no choice. Only by observing the material that littered the base of the cliffs could they know what minerals, if any, might be above them. On the 15th day, they saw the red-stained stratum. Humboldt quickened his pace, hurrying forward in advance of Barber. The stratum was too high up on the wall to be reached, but it was not necessary to examine it in place. The base of the cliff was piled thick with fragments from it. He felt the first touch of discouragement as he looked at them. They were a sandstone, light in weight. The iron present was only what the Dunbar expedition had thought it to be, a mere discoloration. They made their way slowly along the foot of the cliff, examining piece after piece, in the hope of finding something more than iron stains. There was no variation, however, and a mile farther on they came to the end of the red stratum. Beyond that point the rocks were gray, without a vestige of iron. "So that," Barber said, looking back the way they had come, "is what we were going to build a ship out of. Iron stains." Humboldt did not answer. For him it was more than a disappointment. It was the death of a dream he had held since the year he was 9 and had heard that the Dunbar expedition had seen iron-stained rock in a deep chasm, the only iron-stained rock on the face of Ragnarok. Surely, he had thought, there would be enough iron there to build a small ship. For 11 years he had worked toward the day when he would find it. Now he had found it, and it was nothing. The ship was as far away as ever. But discouragement was as useless as iron-stained sandstone. He shook it off and turned to Barbara. "Let's go," he said. "Maybe we'll find something by the time we circle the chasm." For 7 days they risked the danger of death from downward plunging rocks and found nothing. On the 8th day they found the treasure that was not treasure. They stopped for the evening just within the mouth of one of the chasm's tributaries. Humboldt went out to get a drink where a trickle of water ran through the sand, and as he knelt down he saw the flash of something red under him, almost buried in the sand. He lifted it out. It was a stone half the size of his hand, darkly translucent and glowing in the light of the setting sun like blood. It was a ruby. He looked and saw another gleam a little farther up the stream. It was another ruby, almost as large as the first one. Near it was a flawless blue sapphire. Scattered here and there were smaller rubies and sapphires, down to the size of grains of sand. He went farther upstream and saw specimens of still another stone. They were colorless but burning with internal fires. He rubbed one of them hard across the ruby he still carried, and there was a gritting sound as it cut a deep scratch in the ruby. "I'll be damned," he said aloud. There was only one stone hard enough to cut a ruby: the diamond. It was almost dark when he returned to where Barbara was resting beside their packs. "What did you find to keep you out so late?" Barbara asked curiously. He dropped a double handful of rubies, sapphires, and diamonds at Barbara's feet. "Take a look," he said. "On a civilized world, what you see there would buy us a ship without our having to lift a finger. Here, they're just pretty rocks." "Except the diamonds," he added. "At least we now have something to cut those quartz crystals with." They took only a few of the rubies and sapphires the next morning, but they gathered more of the diamonds, looking in particular for the gray-black and ugly, but very hard and tough carbonado variety. Then they resumed their circling of the chasm's walls. The heat continued its steady increase as the days went by. Only at night was there any relief from it, and the nights were growing swiftly shorter as the blue sun rose earlier each morning. When the yellow sun rose, the chasm became a blazing furnace around the edge of which they crept like ants in some gigantic oven. There was no life in any form to be seen, no animal or bush or blade of grass. There was only the barren floor of the chasm, made a harsh green shade by the two suns, and writhing and undulating with heat waves like a nightmare sea, while above them the towering cliffs shimmered too, and sometimes seemed to be leaning far out over their heads and already falling down upon them. They found no more minerals of any kind, and they came at last to the place where they had seen the smoke or vapor. There the walls of the chasm drew back to form a little valley 1 mile long by 1/2 mile wide. The walls did not drop vertically to the floor there, but sloped out at the base into a fantastic formation of natural roofs and arches that reached almost to the center of the valley from each side. Green things grew in the shade under the arches, and sparkling waterfalls cascaded down over many of them. A small creek carried the water out of the valley, going out into the chasm a little way before the hot sands absorbed it. They stood and watched for some time, but there was no movement in the valley other than the waving of the green plants as a breeze stirred them. Once the breeze shifted to bring them the fresh, sweet scent of growing things, and urged them to come closer. "A place like that doesn't belong here," Barber said in a low voice. "But it's there. I wonder what else is there." "Shade and cool water," Humboldt said. "And maybe things that don't like strangers. Let's go find out." They watched warily as they walked, their crossbows in their hands. At the closer range, they saw that the roofs and arches were the outer remains of a system of natural caves that went back into the valley's walls. The green vegetation grew wherever the roofs gave part-time shade, consisting mainly of a holly-leafed bush with purple flowers and a tall plant resembling corn. Under some of the roofs the corn was mature, the orange-colored grains visible. Under others it was no more than half-grown. He saw the reason, and said to Barber, "There are both warm and cold springs here. The plants watered by the warm springs would grow almost the year round. The ones watered by the cold springs only in the summer. And what we saw from the mountain top would have been vapor rising from the warm springs." They passed under arch after arch without seeing any life. When they came to the valley's upper end and still had seen nothing, it seemed evident that there was little danger of an encounter with any intelligent and hostile creatures. Apparently, nothing at all lived in the little valley. Humboldt stopped under a broad arch where the breeze was made cool and moist by the spray of water it had come through. Barber went on to look under the adjoining arch. Caves led into the wall from both arches, and as he stood there Humboldt saw something lying in the mouth of the nearest cave. It was a little mound of orange corn, lying in a neat pile, as though whatever had left it there had intended to come back after it. He looked toward the other arch, but Barber was somewhere out of sight. He doubted that whatever had left the corn could be much of a menace. Dangerous animals were more apt to eat flesh than corn, but he went to the cave with his crossbow ready. He stopped at the mouth of the cave to let his eyes become accustomed to the darkness inside it. As he did so, the things inside came out to meet him. They emerged into full view. 6 little animals the size of squirrels, each of them a different color. They walked on short hind legs like miniature bears, and the dark eyes in the bear chipmunk faces were fixed on him with intense interest. They stopped 5 feet in front of him, there to stand in a neat row and continue the fascinated staring up at him. The yellow one in the center scratched absently at its stomach with a furry paw, and he lowered the bow, feeling a little foolish at having bothered to raise it against animals so small and harmless. Then he half brought it up again, as the yellow one opened its mouth and said in a tone that held distinct anticipation, "I think we'll eat you for supper." He darted glances to right and left, but there was nothing near him except the 6 little animals. The yellow one, having spoken, was staring silently at him with only curiosity on its furry face. He wondered if some miasma or some scent from the vegetation in the valley had warped his mind into sudden insanity, and asked, "You think you'll do what?" It opened its mouth again to stutter, I, then with a note of alarm, "Hey!" It said no more, and the next sound was that of Barber hurrying toward him and calling, "Hey, Bill, where are you?" "Here," he answered, and he was already sure that he knew why the little animal had spoken to him. Barber came up and saw the 6 chipmunk bears. "6 of them!" he exclaimed. "There's one in the next cave. The damn thing spoke to me." "I thought so," he replied. "You told it we'd have it for supper, and then it said, 'You think you'll do what?' didn't it?" Barber's face showed surprise. "How did you know that?" "They're telepathic, between one another," he said. "The yellow one there repeated what the one you spoke to heard you say, and it repeated what the yellow one heard me say. It has to be telepathy between them." Telepathy? Barber stared at the 6 little animals, who stared back with their fascinated curiosity undiminished. But why should they want to repeat aloud what they received telepathically? I don't know. Maybe at some stage in their evolution only part of them were telepaths, and the telepaths broadcasted danger warnings to the others that way. So far as that goes, why does a parrot repeat what it hears? There was a scurry of movement behind Barber, and another of the little animals, a white one, hurried past them. It went to the yellow one, and they stood close together as they stared up. Apparently, they were mates. "That's the other one. Those are the two that mocked us," Barber said, and thereby gave them the name by which they would be known. Mockers. End of Episode 6.